Sometimes the funniest thing to say is mean. You know what I mean? It's a tough position to be in. So I say a lot of mean things. But you guys gotta remember, I'm not saying it to be mean. I'm saying it because it's funny. And everything's funny till it happens to you.
Tone. That's what that was. The bird revelation begins in media res. In other words, it's an intro without an intro. You're just dropped into the deep end of a set at what is seemingly a closing idea. How did we get to such a truth? We're greeted by B-roll as Chappelle strolls into the belly room at the Comedy Store, with Moss Rev's Revelations playing over a handwritten title card. The song celebrates Black power and Black identity and subtly points out the racial topics that Chappelle will discuss, like with Colin Kaepernick. That establishes a few things. The belly room is intimate, there are only about 50 audience members. Contrary to almost every other Chappelle special, even its sister, Equanimity, this taping of the bird revelation wasn't in an arena or stadium, and there's no MC to hype him up like this.
Theater in Washington, D.C., Dave Chappelle.
Or this. There are countless stories which feature Dave just riffing and pulling up to the store, bumping every other comic so he can do his thing, and this seems no different. His reputation precedes him. Another thing to note immediately is Chappelle's use of the stool. Typically, comics use their physical stature and presence as a vessel for gestures and act outs, and as a way to establish the dynamic of performer and audience. Here, Chappelle's entire set is delivered from a small wooden stool, which is unique. Can you imagine the Unstoppable being delivered from a stool? Yo, guys, 10,000 people in the stadium. Iceberg Slim, am I right, guys? Only the Comedy Store could allow Dave to literally get down on his audience's level so that listeners are more receptive to his insights. Sitting changes the relationship between comics and audience. Standing projects authority, and sitting invites conversation. Throughout the Bird Revelation, Chappelle isn't performing at the audience so much as talking with them.
Yep, ladies and gentlemen, these are dark, dark times.
After the opening establishes an intimate tone, Chappelle immediately pivots into the biggest story in America. At the time, the collapse of Hollywood. Charlie Rose, Harvey Weinstein, Kevin Spacey, Louis C.K. The audience doesn't need any setup here. These stories dominated the news cycle, and Dave simply acknowledges the moment everyone in the room is already living through. What's interesting isn't the material, it's the delivery. Rather than presenting these as polished conclusions, Chappelle speaks as though he's thinking aloud. He's jumping between scandals, interrupting himself, banging the mic on his knee. Wandering into tangents, and then he circles back. It feels like we're watching him process these events in real time. Whether every transition was improvised is almost beside the point, though. The performance is carefully constructed to feel unconstructed. That illusion accomplishes something important. It lowers the audience's guard. Instead of lecturing, Dave appears to be inviting everyone into the conversation. Before asking difficult questions, he first establishes common ground. Nearly everyone in the room agrees that what happened was wrong. Only once that agreement exists does he begin complicating it. The turning point arrives with Louis C.K.
And you know the tough part, being a comedian, knowing the mother. Everybody comes up to me like, did you know? Did you know what Louis was doing?
Dave explicitly states the women are right. Then, almost immediately, he introduces a new phrase:
Come on, man, that's a brittle spirit.
brittle spirit. It's the first original philosophical idea of the special. Until now, Chappelle has been reacting to headlines. From this point onward, he begins examining how people respond to suffering, fear, and injustice. The question shifts from who was right to what makes someone right, what makes them resistant. That shift is subtle enough that many viewers don't notice it, yet it marks the moment the bird revelation stops being commentary on current events and starts becoming an argument.
I am a black dude. And don't ever forget how I got here. My ancestors were kidnapped. Only the strongest survived. And once they got here, they beat the humanity out of my people. They turned us into beasts of burdens. They made us do their work. And the irony is, hundreds of years later, they called us lazy. We fought in the Civil War. We damn near freed ourselves. And Dr. King was born. And then things got better. 20 years after Dr. King was assassinated, Michael Jackson was moonwalking on television. Something, Barack Obama.
Once Chappelle introduces brittle spirit, the special becomes less about Hollywood and more about perspective. Dave takes one issue and places it next to something larger. Louis C.K. becomes a setup for resilience. The national anthem is a setup for black history. Kaepernick is a setup for sacrifice, and a woman's fear becomes a setup for empathy. Every joke turns into an analogy. Chappelle does this most clearly when he shifts from Me Too to slavery. In the special, it makes sense because he isn't comparing individual suffering, he's comparing how people carry pain. He essentially asks, what does it mean to survive something and keep going? That's why the slavery section matters. It gives Dave a moral scale. He walks through 400 years of black history, then lands on the absurdity of white outrage over kneeling during the national anthem. The joke works because the contrast is enormous. A people survive slavery, Jim Crow, lynching, segregation, and state violence. Then America loses its mind over a knee. The same pattern appears when Dave talks about leaving Chappelle's show.
I watched one of these nature shows one time, and they were talking about how a bushman finds water when it's scarce. And they do what's called a salt trap. I didn't know this. Apparently baboons love salt.
Okay.
So they put a lump of salt in a hole, and they wait for the baboon. The baboon comes, sticks his hand in the hole, grabs the salt makes his hand bigger, and he's trapped. He can't get his hand out. Now, if he's smart, all he does is let go of the salt. Baboon doesn't want to let go of the salt. Then the bushman just comes, takes the baboon, throws him in the cage, and gives him all the salt he wants. And then the baboon gets thirsty. The bushman lets him out of the cage. The first place the baboon runs to is water. Bushman follows him, and they both drink to their fill. And in that analogy, I felt like the baboon. But I was smart enough to let go of the salt.
He rejected $50 million, disappeared, got called crazy, watched the industry move on without him, and yet he still came back. He isn't only mocking fragile people, he's saying, I know what it costs to stand on principle, and that's what leads him directly into Kaepernick. Dave sees Colin Kaepernick as someone who took a real hit for someone else. He had money, fame, and status, but still chose a public act that cost him his career. That matters because the special keeps asking who pays the price when systems are challenged. After spending much of the special challenging women's reactions to misconduct, he finally gives an analogy that helps him understand their fear.
One time I did a real good set, and these called me in the back room. They gave me $25,000 in cash. I jumped on the subway and started heading towards Brooklyn at 1 o'clock in the morning. Never been that terrified in my life. Because I never in my life had something that somebody else would want. I thought to myself, Jesus Christ, if you knew how much money I had in this backpack, they'd kill me for it. Then I thought, holy shit. What if I had a pussy on me all the time?
Carrying $25,000 through New York at night. For the first time, he doesn't frame fear as a weakness. He frames it as the burden of having something other people want to take. That's why the line about carrying a vagina lands. It's crude, but structurally it's doing important work. It translates an experience he doesn't personally know into one he does. That's what makes it feel special than topical comedy. He takes the audience from scandal to history, history to protest, protest to personal sacrifice, and from personal sacrifice to gendered fear. And once you notice that, the whole special itself starts to look less like a loose riff and more like a chain of analogies leading toward the final story.
I empathize, man, you know. Everybody gets mad because I say these jokes. But you understand that this is the best time to say them. More now than ever. And I know there's some comedians in the back. You have a responsibility to speak recklessly. Otherwise, my kids may never know what reckless talk sounds like. The joys of being wrong. I didn't come here to be right.
By this point in the special, Chappelle has spent nearly an hour questioning everyone. Hollywood, the media, women, men, white people, black people, even himself. Now he has the answer to the question he's been building towards. What do we do now? His answer isn't punishment, it's reconciliation. Dave argues that fear can start change, but it can't sustain it.
We should fight for one another. We should forgive the ones of us that are weaker and support the ones of us that are stronger. And then we can beat the thing.
The Me Too movement frightened powerful men. That's a necessary first step, but fear alone creates silence, not honesty. People become more concerned with protecting themselves than telling the truth. Instead, Chappelle points to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. After apartheid, the country had every reason to seek revenge. Instead, leaders like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu built a process around confession. Amnesty wasn't granted because crimes didn't matter. It was granted because rebuilding society required people to admit what they'd done without believing that every confession would destroy their lives. That distinction becomes the philosophical center of the special. Dave argues that systems don't survive because every individual inside them is evil. They survive because ordinary people participate in them, often out of fear, ambition, or self preservation. If those people believe confession guarantees exile, they'll never admit their role. That idea explains one of the special's deepest lines.
And I'm telling you right now, you're going to have a lot of imperfect allies.
You'll have many imperfect allies. It's an uncomfortable sentence because it asks something difficult of both sides. It asks guilty people to be honest, and it asks victims to accept help from people who aren't morally spotless. Whether you agree with that philosophy is up to you. The story about carrying $25,000 through Brooklyn isn't there to simply get a laugh. It's an attempt to translate someone else's fear into terms he understands personally. Throughout the Bird Revelation, Dave repeatedly searches for analogies that shrink the distance between experiences. That's reconciliation in practice, not agreement, understanding. By now, the special has moved far beyond stand up. Dave isn't trying to convince the audience that his opinions are correct, he's trying to convince them that empathy requires imagination, and imagination begins by asking what someone else's burden might feel like. Throughout the special, Chappelle repeatedly promises to explain why he walked away from Chappelle's show. By the time he finally returns to it, there's barely 10 minutes left in the special, and instead of answering it directly, he tells the story about a pimp.
Iceberg Slim, his real name was Robert Beck. He got the name Iceberg because he was in a bar in Chicago and there was a shootout in the bar and a bullet went through his hat and he still finished his drink. Pimps love like that. They said, man, you ice cold. And he said, I like that.
Iceberg Slim's story isn't really about prostitution, it's about systems of exploitation. The genius of his allegory is that the pimp almost never relies on violence alone. He creates dependency.
Iceberg Slim is trying to control the woman that he finds uncontrollable. So he asks older pimp how he can rein her in. And the older pimp says, oh, that's easy, Iceberg. All you have to do is beat that run her a bath and give her some pills. She'll be so grateful that you fixed her that she'll forget you were the mother beat her in the first place.
He convinces people they're making their own choices while quietly manipulating every option available to them.
Called her to a diner. He said, look, you and I got to part ways. She said, fine, I don't need you anyway. Got one last trick for you. It's a big money trick. He said, fine, what do you want me to do? He said, okay, there's a guy in that hotel across the street. He's waiting for you in room number 7. Once you go over there and I want you to fuck. But before you do, I need you to put some of this stuff in this drink. And she runs up to the motel steps and she disappears in room number 7. And she's gone for a real long time. Real long time. So long, in fact, that Iceberg got a little worried. But then, suddenly, she came back. He said, what's going on? There's a briefcase. She said, I didn't get it, Daddy. He said, what do you mean you didn't get the briefcase? What's wrong with you? She said, oh, I did everything you said, but that man don't look right. Something wrong, Daddy. He said, what do you mean something's wrong? Put that stuff in his drink. She said, I did everything you said, Daddy. I put all of it in his drink. He said, wait a minute, bitch. Wait a minute. You put all of it in his drink? Now he had to see for himself.
A woman believes she's committed murder. She's terrified. She's emotionally dependent on the one person she thinks can protect her. Later do we learn that none of it was real. The body wasn't dead. The doctor wasn't a doctor. The movers weren't criminals. And the entire crisis was manufactured. The only thing that was real was her fear. That's exactly why Dave waited until the end to tell the story. If he'd opened the special with an attack on Hollywood's power structures, the audience would have resisted it. Instead, he spent an hour earning their trust. He led them through scandals, race, empathy, reconciliation, and sacrifice, before asking them to reinterpret his own career through an allegory. Notice what he never does. He never says, Hollywood was my pimp. He trusts the audience to make the connection themselves. That's the revelation. The title doesn't refer only to the bird story, it refers to the audience's realization. Dave doesn't hand us the conclusion, he lets us arrive there. Throughout the hour, Chappelle consistently refuses to over-explain. He presents ideas, allegories, and stories, believing the audience is intelligent enough to connect them. Final line, now we have ourselves a little secret, isn't just about Iceberg Slim, it's about us. We've reached the same understanding Dave has without him ever having to state it outright. That's why the bird revelation feels so different than a traditional stand-up special. Let's return to the opening.
Till it happens to you.
After an hour of stories, analogies, and philosophy, that line means something entirely different. At first, it sounds like a punchline. Now it sounds like a warning. It isn't trying to tell us who's right, it's trying to convince us that perspective changes everything. Every section of the special asks us to inhabit someone else's experience, whether it's a woman navigating Hollywood, Colin Kaepernick sacrificing his career, Dave walking away from 50 million, or a frightened woman trapped by Iceberg Slim's deception. That's why the special resonates years later. The headlines might have faded, the scandals have changed, but the underlying question is still ever so present. What happens when something stops being someone else's problem and becomes yours? And that's why I think The Bird Revelation isn't just one of Dave Chappelle's greatest specials. It's one of the finest examples of stand-up as philosophy.